Now, Jon Snow and Tanya Sillim with the Channel 4 News.
The UN says it can no longer protect Britons and Americans in Iraq and orders those remaining out. Good evening. Amid escalating tension over Iraq and the almost daily bomb runs by British and American jets, the UN has tonight finally given up on the pretense that US and UK nationals can go on working for them there. This, as the CIA reports, the Afghan guerrilla leader Osama bin Laden may be plotting attacks any day on American installations. Tonight, what's the West really doing, and is it risking wider destabilization across the Middle East? We'll be talking live with the United Nations in New York, and here with Iraq's neighbor, Syria's Foreign Minister Farouk al-Shara. Also tonight, amid the HODL hoo-ha, why England finally failed in the World Cup. Exclusive information that the FA is doing its damnedest to suppress. And on the day, a new survey has found 1 in 5 children suffers from a mental health problem. We've been to investigate one radical solution.
I'll be reporting from a primary school which has a full-time psychotherapist to help the pupils deal with the stress of modern living.
In the other headlines tonight, security chiefs in Northern Ireland are investigating a potential new threat to the peace process after claims that the loyalist Ulster Volunteer Force is rearming. The family of a scientist involved in Britain's germ warfare tests is trying to get to the truth behind his sudden death. And hooked in the womb, the NHS gets new guidelines on how to deal with pregnant drug users.
So the United Nations has ordered its last American staff to leave Iraq and warned Britons to remain out of the country because it can't guarantee their safety. It's evidence that although the big bangs are over, the war in the Gulf has not gone away. Every day sees new clashes over Iraq's no-fly zones, the Allied military campaign unabated. But whilst Saddam Hussein looks secure, leadership changes elsewhere mean the Middle East is facing an uncertain future. In a moment, we'll be talking live with one of the region's most influential politicians, Syria's Foreign Minister Farouk al-Shara. But first, Sarah Shah reports.
For months, the United Nations has been resisting Iraqi demands that 14 British and American humanitarian workers leave Iraq. Now, in a sign that tensions are escalating, the UN Security Chief has asked all US and UK nationals working for it to leave the country.
This follows the aide-memoire from the government of Iraq to the UN on the 4th of January, saying that it was unable to ensure the security of US and UK nationals serving with the UN in Iraq.
Day after day, barely reported, Britain and the US have been launching attacks on Iraqi targets. That's now been stepped up. US planes yesterday hit Iraqi weapons designed to strike ships.
Now we have a situation which is no longer tit for tat. That is, the Americans have attacked a missile launch installation, anti-shipping missiles, launching installation yesterday, which clearly did not have as a purpose the shooting down of American and British aircraft. So in effect an extension of operations, and in a way the Iraqis are replying to that.
It's all been triggered by Saddam Hussein's refusal to acknowledge the northern and southern no-fly zones. In the past week there have been dozens of attacks nibbling away at Saddam's radar and communications sites. Last night 6 military objectives were hit. A couple of days ago 2 radio and communication sites were taken out. A radar station was hit. US warplanes attacked Iraqi launchers in the Gulf, and British jets fired at Iraqi aircraft in the south. So does this latest move mean another full-scale attack like Operation Desert Fox in December? Probably not.
The decision by the UN to withdraw UN personnel does not necessarily mean attacks from the West. It may mean that they feel they can't protect UN personnel from Saddam Hussein, who controls that territory. Saddam single-mindedly wishes to do 2 things. One is have the sanctions lifted, and the other is carry on developing weapons of mass destruction. We have said, the United Nations has said, he can't have both. And he's maneuvering in every possible way to try to bring an end to the sanctions, and I would imagine that this is part of that maneuvering.
But the phony war of the last few days has had casualties. A stray US missile killed 11 people in the city of Basra. It's gravely concerned even Arab governments who've supported attacks on Iraq. In Syria, the US embassy was looted. The Syrian foreign minister will be trying to clarify whether Britain's real agenda is to try to topple Saddam. Getting rid of a strong, if ruthless, leader is causing grave concern in a region where no less than 5 key figures who've held the area together are ailing or facing removal. Looking into the future of this most volatile region has never been harder. Today's news at least makes it clear things aren't going to calm down.
Sarah Shah reporting. Well, now the Syrian Foreign Minister, Farouk al-Sharrah, has been having talks in London with Robin Cook on the Iraqi crisis. He joins us from his London hotel. Foreign Minister, you're no friend of Saddam Hussein, but how do you view the continuing bombing of Iraq?
It's not acceptable. It's not only the Syrian position, but all the Arab foreign ministers' position, which was expressed last week in Cairo. We said very clearly that the military option should not be repeated, and only the political or diplomatic solution is to be carried out.
But what is the specific alternative to bombing right now? I mean, what could be done that would make any difference?
Well, the bombing is futile. I guess that it only hurts the Iraqi people. It doesn't change the picture. It doesn't lead to anywhere. And that's the ordeal of the Iraqis. For the last 8 years, they have been under very heavy pressure because of the economic sanctions.
But what specifically could be done right now to change all that?
To lift the sanctions. I mean, this is something that we expressed in Cairo. All the Arab countries have accepted.
But Robin Cook, who you saw today, would regard that as simply giving in to Saddam Hussein. It's particularly what he wants.
Well, the British government have a different view, but they understand why the Arabs stood against the continuity of the sanctions, because only the Iraqi people are paying the price. And also, I mean, after 8 years of sanctions, the picture didn't change on the ground, except more suffering.
Well, now, a picture that is changing, and changing pretty rapidly, is the overall picture in the Middle East. You have King Hussein in weakening health. You have a change of government probable in Israel, or possible certainly, and you have the Americans basically looking at Iraq and apparently nowhere else. How serious would you view the state of the peace process in the Middle East now?
Well, the peace process for the last 3 years is in a deadlock, in a stalemate. It's frozen. It's about to die. It depends very much on the outcome of the elections in Israel, the determination of the United States, and the European role in this very important process.
But the elections, do you think that they could produce anybody in Israel that would actually make a difference to the process?
Well, we hope so, but I don't like to get involved in this domestic affairs. What I wish is that the peace process is revived and peace talks are resumed from where they left off.
Now, let's just look at Jordan, because that's your other neighbor, and you have a situation in which King Hussein is far from well, could well die. He has suddenly changed the succession. Are you worried about Jordan?
Well, we are sorry for the deterioration in the health of the king. We hope that there would be no problem as far as the transition period is concerned. Israel is trying to benefit out of that. Israel is trying to accuse Syria or some other Arab countries in the region that they want to destabilize Jordan. This is absolutely fake, absolutely groundless.
You have been Syria's foreign minister for a long time.
Yes.
Do you think that there will actually be a settlement over the Golan Heights whilst you are still foreign minister?
Well, I hope so. I mean, eventually the Golan Heights are Syrian territory. They will get back to Syria. sooner or later. I mean, the United Nations resolutions stipulate that these territories are Syrian, should return to Syria, and demand Israel to evacuate the Golan Heights. And we had, in fact, concluded more or less more than 80% of the objective of the negotiations launched in Madrid. And we had a commitment by the previous Israeli governments that Israel should withdraw completely from the Golan to the 4th of June 1990, from the June 1967 line, and that was a commitment which has to be endorsed and respected.
That's what you would hope might come from any kind of a change in the Israeli government.
Yes.
Foreign Minister, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And more on Iraq later, when we'll be talking live with a senior United Nations official in New York. First, though, a new threat to peace in Northern Ireland. With more on that and other news, Tanya.
Thanks, John. Loyalist paramilitaries may be rearming in case the Northern Ireland peace process collapses, it's been claimed tonight. Some sections of the Ulster Volunteer Force have said they've taken charge of a smuggled consignment of weapons, including an anti-tank gun. Officials from the security forces have now ordered an urgent investigation. Eamon Malley, our regular commentator on Irish affairs, is in Belfast. Eamon, what can you tell us about this consignment?
Well, this particular claim came from what's known as the North Brigade of the UVF. Now, there's been no denial of this from people associated or linked in some way or other with this particular body. The bottom line is, though, that in or among these organisations, there is this culture that if indeed arms are on offer, people take them. That's the culture. So it doesn't mean, and I think that David Irvin has articulated this very properly, it doesn't mean, however, that the UVF are poised or about to withdraw their support for the Good Friday Agreement or for the Progressive Unionist Party's involvement in the peace process in the Assembly at Parliament buildings.
So your reading of it would be that it was more a shot across the bows of the leadership of the UVF than indeed the IRA or indeed the government?
Well, one can never be definitive as to the thinking behind this, but there's another factor coming into play possibly here. In recent weeks, months, we have the emergence within loyalism of other groupings. We have the Red Hand Defenders and we have the Orange Volunteers. Now, it's conceivable, because of their activities on the ground, that territorially, some elements within the UVF are saying, well, gosh, we're not going to allow these people to upstage us, so we're going to be in a position of readiness. There's another factor. The fact is that there are elements of republicanism still very active in Northern Ireland. There's Continuity IRA, who have not declared a ceasefire, and there's a suspicion that other elements are active. So from that point of view, it may well be that the UVF are simply readying themselves in the eventuality of a worsening situation. But, as I said at the outset, there is no indication whatsoever that the UVF are about to withdraw their support for the Good Friday Agreement.
Eamon, thank you very much. In the United States, the Defense Secretary William Cohen has told Congress that a relatively small force of 2,000 to 4,000 troops may be needed in Kosovo, but only if a firm peace agreement is reached between the two sides. He added that other NATO members would make up the majority of the force. And still in the United States, a judge has fined an anti-abortion group more than $100 million for making illegal threats over the internet. The group, called Planned Parenthood, created wanted posters and set up a website listing the names and addresses of abortion doctors and clinics.
This activity must stop. Intimidation is wrong. These doctors must be permitted to practice medicine as their patients choose.
The group now plans to appeal against today's ruling, calling it an obscene assault on freedom of speech. Police in Exeter said today that they believe the schoolboy George Mortimer, who went missing last Friday, was murdered. His body was found by divers in a canal yesterday after a search which lasted for 3 days. The 12 airline passengers who forced their transatlantic flight to make an unscheduled stop because of a mid-air brawl have arrived back in Britain. They flew to Gatwick Airport after being stranded for 3 days at an American airport. They've been questioned by police, and Air Tours is considering billing them for the cost of diverting the plane. Charles Bronson, who's been described as Britain's most disruptive inmate, has released the prison warden he's been holding hostage. The warden had been held in the close supervision unit at Hull Prison since Monday by Mr. Bronson, who changed his name from Michael Peterson in honour of the star of the Death Wish films.
Glenn Hoddle's sacking became a political football today, for although most of the country might have an opinion, William Hague told the Prime Minister today he should have kept his thoughts to himself. Indeed, Mr Blair's spokesman later admitted he'd be sorry if his comments about Mr Hoddle had influenced the FA's decision. It is a brave man who'll replace Hoddle, or a solid one anyway. Howard Wilkinson, who's acting as temporary coach, spoke for the first time today at a press conference described as deeply uncontroversial. Sue Turton reports.
The Tory captain had Blair and his forward line on the back foot as Hoddle's departure became the match of the day.
So, who does the Prime Minister think should be the next manager of the England football team?
Should Prime Minister's questions really be concerned with football?
I can scarcely believe that. Well, not him anyway, Madam Speaker. And I'm content to leave that, I think, to the FA.
Given what he's just said, will he accept for future reference and on reflection that there is a limit to the number of things politicians should poke their noses into? And that, yes, there is. And that lecturing football associations on who they should sack is beyond that limit.
And the former FA chairman, Sir Bert Millichip, agrees. Today he attacked Blair and his sports minister Tony Banks for hounding Hoddle out. But Hoddle's faith healer sees a wider vendetta.
I put the blame 100% on the media, and also there wasn't enough people to stick up for him. And I must say again that a lot of people are afraid of the media. They will not speak up against the media because they know what they're like.
This is the man currently trying on Hoddle's boots for size. Howard Wilkinson comes from the old school of management and over a 25-year career managing Leeds and Sheffield Wednesday has learnt one of the basic rules: keep your own counsel.
I have a great interest in religious beliefs. Fortunately, I confine them to the dinner table, especially after I've had a glass or two of nice wine. My brief is to look after the team as manager until next Thursday. I reckon if I'm very, very careful between now and then, there won't be much to look into.
As caretaker manager just for a week, Wilkinson will have no time to stamp his mark on the squad either. He announced Hoddle's planned lineup for next week's friendly against France. Glenn Hoddle joins a sizable club of old boys. Of the 32 coaches from last year's World Cup in France, 23 have either been sacked or resigned from their posts. But none of his colleagues' departures caused such political repercussions. Wilkinson faced the usual barrage today as the press stewed over who would get the job long term. But Eileen Drury has her own ideas about how to warn off the media.
If you had 6 strong women on the committee of the FA, then they would have stopped the tabloids months ago from hounding him, because that is what we're like. Women are much stronger in many ways than men.
OK, well, I appreciate if you move on from there, because there's neighbours and there's a few complaints gone in.
Maybe Glenn should ask Eileen round. Surely one stiff word from her would get rid of the pack still camped out on his doorstep.
Sue Turton. Well, they thought it was all over. Well, it is now. As if losing a manager wasn't enough, it seems the Football Association has lost the plot altogether. Scientists believe they've discovered the secret of World Cup success, yet the FA is desperate to cover it all up. The experts studied every move by every player in all 36 matches in the World Cup and found that the cup was actually won and lost in the hole, right in front of the D outside the penalty area. Details will be published in the New Scientist magazine tomorrow. The FA won't release the data which shows why England failed. Our science correspondent Andrew Veach reports.
This is the secret of the French success. Zinedine Zidane in the World Cup final, passing the ball from the hole, the killer zone just in front of the D.
Zidane again, could be in for something here.
The first scientific match analysis published tomorrow shows that Zidane was the best exponent. Here's Dennis Bergkamp in that same zone when Holland played Brazil. The shot went wide, but the figures showed he excelled in this position.
The scientists call it Zone 14. The teams which reached the semi-finals made an average of 25 successful passes from here in each match. Unsuccessful teams made only 15 passes per match. So what about England? Well, the details are still secret. The Football Association's technical coordinator, Robin Russell, is refusing to let the scientists publish the results. He says the FA holds the copyright and they won't release the figures until they've finished studying them.
It's not clear why the English should be so secretive about tactics which failed. Successful teams were happy for their secrets to be revealed. But Channel 4 News can disclose that the analysis by scientists at Liverpool John Moores University shows a very different style of play. The English made far less use of Zone 14 than teams like France and Brazil. They relied on going wide down the wings and crossing into the box. Tactics abandoned by Michael Owen when he launched his one-man assault on Argentina. He headed straight for the killer zone in front of the D.
So now you know, courtesy of Andrew Beach and New Scientist magazine. The scientist investigating the government's early germ warfare testing has called for a fresh report into the possible causes of a string of birth defects in southern England. Last year, the government was forced to admit that vast quantities of bacteria were sprayed across the region during experiments at the top-secret Porton Down research establishment in Wiltshire. Now the relatives of one scientist who died in unexplained circumstances say the secrecy is hampering their efforts to get to the truth, as Peter Wilson reports.
He died when I was 4. I don't remember too much about him. I'm certain I can remember the night he went into hospital, and that was the last time I saw him.
In 1970, Robin Southey was a scientist at Porton Down, the government's top-secret germ and chemical warfare laboratory.
My father was signed to the Official Secrets Act. He couldn't say anything, even to a GP. If the GP misdiagnosed him, he would just have to tolerate it.
Philip's father was part of a group which sprayed massive quantities of apparently harmless bacteria over southern England in the 1960s and 70s to assess the consequences of a Cold War attack using biological or chemical weapons.
The word that sticks in my mind that I asked the vicar to use at his funeral was reliable.
In the middle of the tests, Robin Southey became seriously ill with stomach cramps. He had a perforated bowel. 5 days later, he was dead.
Well, you have to remember it was the height of the Cold War. Porton was veiled in secrecy, and certainly 30 years on, nobody's talking. We've asked various colleagues just to reassure us, to tell us things, and we cannot get any answers out of them.
Unusually, there was no inquest into Robin Southey's death. A post-mortem examination simply gave the cause of death as peritonitis. Since seeing our report on the tests, shown last June, the family have obtained Robin Southey's personnel file from Porton Down. It is exhaustive, but there's scarcely any mention of his sudden death, leading the family to believe they're not being told the whole truth.
In Robin's medical file, there were details of every single immunisation he'd had. A sick note for influenza, details of a minor accident involving a splash in his eye. His last serious final illness was just a death certificate. Now, are you telling me that somewhere someone didn't go, someone didn't write a report, and where is the medical certificate that I submitted for that week?
Robin Southey worked here at Porton Down, one of 6 microbiologists who carried out a series of germ warfare tests. An independent report goes some way towards vindicating the MOD's position that those experiments were harmless, but it does nothing to consider the possible toxic effects of the metals used in the tests. Between 1953 and 1977, Porton carried out around 120 tests, spraying the bacteria Bacillus globigii, Serrata maricens, and E. coli, as well as the compound zinc-cadmium sulfide. Concern about the trials goes far beyond the families of those directly involved. At East Lulworth in Dorset, there's a lingering conviction, in spite of official denials, that the tests were responsible for a string of birth defects in children born in the 1960s and 70s. That public apprehension sparked 2 investigations last year. One by the Dorset Health Authority is still incomplete. The other, independently prepared for the MOD, has just been handed in.
What we can't rule out is that for a very small number of people who had some underlying disease, for example, serious lung disease, and people with cystic fibrosis, there's a very small possibility that some of those individuals might have got a chest infection. But for the vast majority of people, I don't think there were any health risks. One question that needs to be investigated is that there was a release in the late 1950s of a chemical, zinc cadmium sulfide, and that was sprayed over much of the United Kingdom, and we really don't know the quantities that would have been inhaled by people to see whether there is any possible risk from those experiments.
The MOD has now agreed on a separate report on the toxicology of the tests, so a final verdict, some sort of official clarity on the South Coast trials, is still months away.
Peter Wilson reporting from Dorset. Now, are you confused by pensions? You could very well be. The government launched a new savings initiative today and it's not even sure what to call it. Analysts have dubbed it the LISA, or Lifetime Individual Savings Account. And as our economics reporter Liam Halligan now explains, it adds to the bewildering choice which consumers now face.
Today saw yet another new pension, adding to the alphabet soup of schemes. Don't feel bad about being confused, because most of the experts are too. The idea of a LISA is to make saving cheaper. You make regular contributions which are then invested by a private firm in bundles of shares known as unit trust. The government doesn't tax you on the gains, so as long as the stock market performs, you get a nice fat pension. So if that's a LISA, what of the much talked about stakeholder pensions? Stakeholder schemes also rely on regular contributions being invested by private firms, so they're very similar to LISAs. But a big difference is that stakeholders will be regulated not by the pensions industry, but by non-profit-making independent trustees, reflecting continued fears of pension mis-selling.
There are so many different kinds of pensions that are going to be on offer. I think people will find it very, very difficult to understand. And what the government needs to do is address the need for simplicity.
As well as LISAs, we also hear about ISAs. While a LISA is like a pension, holding your money until retirement, you can withdraw money from an ISA much earlier, even when you're still working. The first ISAs will come on stream in April, replacing similar schemes, more alphabet soup, known as PEPs and TESAs. But LISAs, stakeholders, ISAs, why so many new pensions when the idea was to make things less complicated? If the schemes serve different purposes, who are LISAs meant for? Current pensioners won't be affected, and those with occupational and personal schemes can also say no to LISAs. Treasury ministers hope LISAs will encourage more long-term saving, particularly among workers earning less than £20,000 a year. But the pensions industry is sceptical. Many analysts say the alphabet soup is less part of a well-balanced pensions menu than the result of rival ministers insisting on their own pet schemes.
Liam Halligan reporting. You're watching Channel 4 News, our main headlines tonight. There are new fears for the Northern Ireland peace process as security forces investigate claims that loyalist paramilitaries could be rearming. The row over Glenn Hoddle's sacking has reached the House of Commons as William Hague told Tony Blair he should have kept his nose out of the affair. And the United Nations has ordered its last remaining American and British staff to leave Iraq and told Britons that are away already to stay away because it cannot guarantee their safety. Now, drugs can wreck your health even before you've been born. Today, the NHS has been offered new guidelines on how to cope with pregnant mothers hooked on drugs. It's a growing problem. In Manchester alone, the number of addicted babies has gone up 8-fold over the past 5 years. Our North of England correspondent Stephen Smith has been with a heroin user in the final states of pregnancy and the midwife who's dedicated to helping mothers like her.
Maxine Smith is due to have a daughter, her first child, in 9 days' time. Like many expectant mothers, she's had a craving during her pregnancy. It's for heroin.
I thought I'd wake up in the morning, the penny would drop or something click in my head, and everything would like go away. You won't want to do it anymore. You don't want to do it, but sometimes, you know, you can't control the feelings you've got inside.
I think she's doing very well. I mean, Maxine first approached me when she was very, very early on in her pregnancy.
Faye McCrory is a midwife who sees women who are on drugs. There are more and more of them in Manchester, over 130 in the past 12 months. Maxine used to smoke up to 4 bags of heroin a day. That's £40 worth.
Sometimes you ended up going smoking off with people that you couldn't stand in houses that you'd never even normally drink a cup of water in. But just for the sake of the fact that they're doing what you're doing, you had that in common. So, you know, you'd close your eyes to the mess and the shit you're walking over, the the fact that they've probably got needles hanging about when you don't even use needles yourself, putting yourself at risk basically just to have a smoke.
Maxine Smith used to finance her habit on the streets.
You just focused on money, because if you weren't, you'd think about the risk. I mean, girls go missing, girls getting killed, and it's girls that you know, and it still doesn't stop you, because you've got that drive to go and get, you want your fix, you want your drugs, you're not bothered about anything else. And I got into trouble. I nearly went to jail for 5 years, and I went in a rehabilitation centre instead, and that saved me from, like, you know, getting myself into real trouble or probably being dead now.
Drug workers say a stable habit can be less harmful to mother and baby than sudden detoxification, but it means the child may be born craving a fix.
Major signs of withdrawal, which I stress major, which may manifest itself in a convulsion, and this doesn't often happen, they will happen after 24 hours and in the main before 72 hours. So we suggest the women stay in for 72 hours. Other
So the
signs
baby could be behaving like a junkie going cold turkey.
Yes, and from the point of view, it would be jittery, sneezing, diarrhea, not all of those, and you know, in varying extremes.
Maxine gets a free prescription for methadone, a drug to treat heroin dependency, but she's still using heroin.
Some people would say, you're pregnant, there's this baby's life to consider. What are you doing carrying on smoking heroin?
Because if it was that simple, nobody'd be on it. It's not the sort of thing that you can wake up and click your fingers and say, right, that's it. It just doesn't go like that. Because it's something where, I don't know whether it's something inside your head or your surroundings, or because you've not got a cigarette, you say, right, well, you want to get some care. It's not like that. I don't know, I'm doing my best.
Manchester's drugs midwife is seeing more and more professional women.
I did have a client, a professional person, who was so concerned that, you know, taking heroin would damage her baby. She did opt for a termination because she was too anxious to approach anybody to ask for information, because she was just too embarrassed and too afraid.
Now Maxine has a home of her own, a steady partner. She can't wait for her baby.
Instead of looking backwards and regretting what I've done, look forwards. I've learned to appreciate what I've got.
That report from Stephen Smith in Manchester. Now, more of today's main news from Tanya.
In Washington, House prosecutors have been interviewing the White House aide, Sidney Blumenthal. They allege that Blumenthal was part of the attempt by President Clinton to obstruct justice in the Lewinsky affair. His deposition marks the last of 3 for the Republican prosecutors, who've been pushing for witnesses to be questioned live on the Senate floor. It now looks unlikely, however, that anyone will appear in person.
In many ways, the Republican leadership is in the same situation as the policymakers in Vietnam. They've forgotten how they got there. They don't know how to get out. They have more exit strategies than there are votes, and it just goes on and on forever.
11 men were rescued in the early hours of this morning from a burning ship off the coast of Cornwall. The fire broke out in the engine room on board an oil rig supply ship, the Tossia Griffin. The fire's now out, and Coast Guards are towing the stranded ship, which is without power, back to port in Falmouth.
The fire alarm went off because there was apparently fire in the engine room, a lot of smoke. So the engine room was sealed, and the inert gas was set off.
Mandy Allwood, who became pregnant after fertility treatment with octuplets but lost all 8, was remanded on bail today when she appeared in court on charges of mortgage fraud. Allwood, who's 33, faces 4 allegations, including 3 of false accounting. In Yemen, the government has announced that British citizens will be subject to stricter visa regulations than anyone else in Europe. Officials said anyone applying for a visa will be excluded from the simplified procedures brought in last year. It follows the arrest of several British men on terrorism charges. The Bank of England committee has been meeting to discuss whether there should be another cut in interest rates. The CBI said there should be a reduction after a survey of high street sales showed that most retailers thought business had slumped in January. Their decision will be announced tomorrow. Sport and familiar news. England have lost their latest 3 Nations match against Sri Lanka by 11 runs. England failed to reach the target of 182 set by Sri Lanka, despite a late chase by the Hollyoake brothers Adam and Ben. The match was cut short due to the weather. With the Bank of England meeting on interest rates, the stock market slipped back for the first time in 4 days. The index of 100 leading shares dropped 72 points. The pound fell 0.1% against the euro, and it was down 0.5% against the dollar. The weather now and tonight will be cloudy but dry across most of the country, with more general rain further north. The northwest will turn showery and cold, with temperatures falling to 4 degrees Celsius and winds gusting to gale force. Tomorrow, a band of cloud along with patchy rain and drizzle will spread across England and Wales, with brighter conditions following in the north. Though most temperatures will stay mild, there'll be severe gale force winds in Scotland. And over the next few days, the north will stay cold and very windy, with occasional rain in the southwest.
They're not just going through a phase. 1 in 5 children suffers from a mental health problem, according to a comprehensive new study. The Mental Health Foundation also found that 1 in 10 youngsters needed professional help for a range of other problems, from mild anxiety to clinical depression. Only yesterday, the government announced an extra £84 million to improve existing services. Our Home Affairs editor, Mark Easton, has been to a school in South London with its own full-time psychotherapist.
This is what is known as messing about in boats.
Childhood. The very word conjures up images from another era. Endless, carefree days. Aggression confined to Mr. Punch and a string of sausages. It's a definition in need of updating. Being a kid in 1999 is often so stressful it causes mental illness. The need to have the right trainers and get your homework done. The fear of social failure, parental divorce, or spots.
Angst, though, is not just a teenage phenomenon. At this infants and junior school here in Southwark in South London, they have a full-time psychotherapist to help the pupils deal with the pressures of modern life.
Mark, let me show you one of our place-to-be counselling rooms.
Deborah John Wilson has opened a place where children as young as 5 can come and pour their heart out.
And what we do here is basically work with children in a very creative way. We have paints, we have pencils, we have paper. They're able to talk about what they're feeling through art, through music. Over here,
with funding from both the education and health departments, the scheme recognises that even primary school children need help to deal with psychological problems.
We have puppets.
Like if I was feeling sad, I can just go there and talk.
Does that make you feel a bit better?
Yeah.
What about you? Do you ever feel slightly pressured by life? Does it ever get on top of you?
Sometimes, when I've got homework the most, because I don't get to play sometimes. I do swimming, then I go club and gymnastics.
So you've got a lot going on. Do you ever feel a bit under pressure? Do you ever feel that it's sort of getting on top of you? There's so much going on?
Yeah.
How serious are the psychological and emotional problems that you're encountering?
Well, I think the thing about it is, you know, that everyday life right now, 1999, is a difficult place for an adult, for children, for everyone. It's a difficult place to be right now. There's a lot of pressures on adults, just like there's a lot of pressures on children. Children talk about everything.
This boy in my class, he's always kicking me. If I only kick the ball and he don't get it, he's always kicking me and saying, "You're not playing and go away," and all this.
How do you feel when he says these things to you?
I feel upset.
The scheme costs about £14,000 a year to run and operates in 10 primary schools in the south of England. Last year, nearly 600 children were referred for help.
Sometimes children come and see me together and they discuss things that are bothering both of them, and we sort of look at it together.
Some parents might feel a little bit dubious, but I think it's because I've had 2 children there myself, and I think it's good. It does what it says it's going to do.
Did you notice the difference after they'd been?
Yeah, I did.
In these days of 1999, as we enter into the year 2000, children need additional support, and that's what's being offered.
There's a jolly amusement park called Joyland.
If childhood ever was the golden idyll of Blyton and Ransom, it certainly isn't now. The place to be reckons between 10 and 25% of primary school pupils suffer mental health problems trying to cope with just being a kid.
Mark Easton reporting. Well, Peter Wilson is a child psychotherapist. He's also the director of Young Minds, a young people's mental health charity. Marina Crooks writes for Bliss, a magazine aimed at girls aged between 15 and 18, and Poppy Perrott is a 15-year-old from North London. Peter Wilson, do we simply know more about the pressures on young people, or is there something about the age we're living in?
I think it's both. I think it's something to do with the age we're living in. There are distinct pressures that we're under. And a recent review of the scientific evidence, fairly dispassionate, really comes up quite clearly that there is an increase in stress in young people, as is shown, for example, in crime or drug and alcohol abuse, eating disorders, depression and so forth. So I think there's some pretty hard evidence to say that's the case.
But specifically, what is it about the age we're living in that in some way is different from, say, even the 1950s?
Well, I think you have to look at it in terms of the last, say, 30 or 40 years, what's been going on gradually and cumulatively. And I think the gist of it is that we are living in an enormous period of change, which is really underpinned by the technology. You know, we have machines, we have TVs, we have computers. It's changed the whole fabric, transport as well. So family life is sort of being shunted around. Children and young people are exposed to a whole range of images and ideas through the television, good or for bad. Families aren't just sort of put together the same way as they were. So I think there's a lot of change going on, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of complexity. And I think that's new, I think that's specific.
Marina, Bliss certainly wasn't around in the 1950s, and neither was any kind of a magazine like it. I mean, really, young people do write in with quite extreme stories.
Yeah, certainly. We get a lot of letters, about 1,000 a week, from readers who want to talk about relationships, questions about sex, a lot of stress problems. And at the moment, things like revision, exam stress, lots of the readers are actually very concerned with that.
Poppy Perry, you are young. You believe these stories?
Do I believe them? Yeah, I think so, because I think the thing about it is that not only like have you got stress from your school, but there's like a whole big thing to like fit in with like your society, and like, oh, you know, not only are you worrying about have I got my work done, is my mum going to tell me off when I got home, but you're like, oh, do I look right, and am I saying the right things, do I have the right haircut?
And have I watched the right edition of the right soap so I can talk about it
tomorrow?
tomorrow?
And it's all just, I don't know, it's quite trivial.
Yeah,
but
body image is really a big factor. I mean, this gets blamed all the time on things like models and Hollywood glamorous, people like Gwyneth Paltrow, but it's not really just that. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that.
But I mean, Bliss is all about body image. I mean, you know, front cover, it's all there.
To an extent, because also it's an entertainment. You know, people read it because it's aspirational, it looks beautiful, because they actually want to see fashion.
But are you stoking it?
No, I think what you've got to remember is we've got 4 pages of problems, and we've got a lot of emotional features, which are really confronting the problems that girls have with the body image.
If you say things like, oh yeah, it's okay, you don't have to be really thin, and then if you look on your fashion pages, all your models are like thin,
yeah,
and it's like, it's kind of a mixed message. It's like, oh yeah, they're saying, okay, it's okay, and then you look on the clothes and you think, oh, I could never wear that because I don't have the body to wear it. And
I know exactly what you mean. The thing is, we'd never use wave models. We tend to use the slightly bigger models, much sporty types.
They're no way like.
What about Peter's point that there isn't the extended family that there was because transport has moved people away, that you're much more dependent on a very narrow range of people?
That's true, because I spend a lot more time with my friends and at school than I do with my family, and it's like, yeah, it's hard to actually have a time to like sit down just with your family for like more than, say, half an hour or something.
Peter, is this a girl thing, a boy thing, equal thing?
No, I think it's an equal thing. I think all young people are in the midst of this change, as indeed we all are. We're all in the midst of this change. I think parents are under
do boys
great
have the
pressure.
same amount of support? And I mean, there are not the boys' magazines that there are.
No,
I mean,
I
it's
don't think
macho,
boys do.
can't exactly admit to the sort of things that are admitted to in Bliss.
Well, also, girls have a really good friendship. They have quite a unique friendship where they're really close, very open, but they can also write to magazines like Bliss, or they can sneakily
Does that match with your experience?
Well, I think boys have got friendships too, but I don't think they're so easy talking about their uncertainties and their worries. You know, there's a certain premium on looking strong, looking competent and efficient and so on. So I think, you know, it's not so easy to talk about vulnerabilities.
But then is the solution literally that the state or somebody has to start supplying psychotherapists to go into institutions like schools to provide what is missing?
I think that's right. I think that is one of the prices of change, if you like, or one of the advantages of change. I mean, there's nothing wrong in a psychotherapist. It's somebody, it's an adult, who actually spends a bit of time listening and talking to a young person.
But then
That's
what
essentially
about
it's
the transition from it simply, a child feeling the blues, as it were, to actually manifesting a serious mental illness?
Yeah. Well, I think this 1 in 5 figure that we've got, it's important to understand it. I mean, I think all young people worry about their bodies, worry about success, worry about exams, family relationships, how they get on with each other. I think that's part of life, that's part of growing up. It's when you get really stuck, when you become preoccupied and it stays on, gets in the way of your freedom to learn, to enjoy life, that's when it becomes problematic. That's the 1 in 5.
Are you conscious of 1 in 5? Does that feel right? 1 in 5 actually do have quite serious mental problems?
Probably. I'd say that was a reasonable figure.
Does that strike you as real? I mean, it does seem an alarmingly high figure.
It does seem high. I think you've got to remember there's lots of people have many problems, and what Peter's saying is true. It's less, but there are a lot of serious problems.
And that's at any one time. Doesn't mean to say that somebody's stuck in that for most of their childhood and adolescence. Some are, and some get worse. But I think some people move in and move out and have difficult periods, and they do need a bit of help to move themselves beyond that.
But is a failure to address this going to lead tomorrow to a population in which there's more offending, more misfitting?
Yeah. There's a lot of evidence now. It's just not my opinion or your opinion. There's evidence now. If you don't actually pay attention to these kind of vulnerabilities and sensibilities that some young people have, you will actually see it show up in delinquency, in alcohol abuse, and so on.
What would make a difference, do you think? What would ease it?
Less homework, but that's not going to happen.
Less homework.
I think, I don't know, I was thinking it's kind of, in a way, it's not kind of in fashion to kind of have support from your family and stuff. And I mean, I don't know, I mean, it might just stop you from like, I mean, I find personally I would rather have support from my friends, but some people might want support from their family and it's like hard to do.
I think
like
also
a rift.
What we're saying is the letters we get, it's often people saying this hasn't been noticed for 2 years, and at school and at home, it just needs to be looked out for a lot more.
Marina Crooks, Poppy Perry, Peter Wilson, thank you all three very much. Tanya, just time for a last look at the headlines.
Well, the Prime Minister has been accused by William Hague of poking his nose into the row which led to Glenn Hoddle's dismissal. Hoddle's temporary replacement, Howard Wilkinson, urged the Football Association to make an impossible job possible. Security chiefs in Northern Ireland are investigating claims that loyalist paramilitaries could be rearming in case the peace process fails. And decades after germ warfare tests at Porton Down, the family of a scientist involved are trying to find the truth behind his sudden death.
And our main headline tonight, the escalating tension in Iraq. Tonight, the United Nations has admitted it cannot guarantee the safety of its British and American staff there. Those who do remain have been ordered to leave. Now, John Mills is head of the Oil for Food program in the Iraq office at the United Nations in New York. He joins us now. John Mills, surely if the United Nations is to mean anything, it means it is a representative body of the international community, and you can send to Iraq whoever you please. This is a bad moment, isn't it?
The principle you enunciated, John, is quite correct. What, however, is the case is that Iraq, like every other member state with UN personnel there, has an obligation to ensure the security and safety of all UN personnel. On the 4th of January, Iraq told us that they couldn't do that for US and UK nationals. The UN replied immediately, saying it's your responsibility. But this is a security issue, and in a number of conversations, both in Baghdad and New York since then, it's clear that Iraq is sticking to its position and it isn't going to change it. So on security grounds alone, the UN Security Coordinator, Benon Sevan, really had no choice but to ask US-UK nationals to leave.
But then if the UN feels that the action against Iraq of a military nature is right, then surely the best thing would be simply to close down the Oil for Food program and exert that pressure on Iraq to come back into the fold.
Let's keep these two issues separate. The military action is one thing. What we're doing in the Oil for Food program is addressing the human dimension of the situation in Iraq, and we try and keep that out of the politics. But this issue, the decision today, is separate again. It's to do with Iraq's obligations under the various international treaties to look after UN personnel, the fact that we don't have that assurance from Iraq, and so just on security grounds, they've come out.
And briefly, are you able to continue with the Oil for Food program, or does this in fact somewhat disable your efforts there?
Well, in fact, 415 international UN staff are in Iraq today. Only 2 of those are US or UK personnel, both are US. So the program will continue. But I must say, no one here is happy about this situation or the decision that's had to be made today.
John Mills in New York, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And that clearly adds to the difficulties surrounding Iraq. As we reported earlier in the programme, the bombing runs have continued right up until last night, and more are still anticipated. We're back, same time, 7 o'clock. Until then, from Tanya and from me, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening.